Good day, students. Let's title this recording Interest Groups, and we'll talk about definitions and we'll talk about types. All right, so our goal here is to provide an operational definition of what an interest group is and does. We'll talk about the First Amendment and we'll relate it to the writings of Alexis de Tocqueville. Then we'll talk about the types and the functions of interest groups. Let us begin. First thing to mention is to think about the First Amendment and the all-important fourth freedom that is listed. You'll remember that the First Amendment starts off by saying Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion. We'll call that the Establishment Clause. Simply put, that the government will not tell you what religion you have to belong to. All right. Then we'll say the First Amendment says Congress shall make no law prohibiting the free exercise thereof. We call that the Free Exercise Clause, meaning the government will limit itself. It won't completely not tell you what to do, but it will limit itself in telling you how to practice your religion. Your First Amendment says Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or the freedom of the press. We call that the Freedom of Expression Clause, right? And now we arrive at our point. The First Amendment to the Constitution says that the right of the people to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances, Congress shall make no law respecting this right. The right to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. That means you have the right to join groups. How do we know this? We know this because we have read through this rather famous book called Democracy in America, written in 1835 by Alexis de Tocqueville. De Tocqueville was, let's say he was a center-left political scientist. He was also a member of parliament in 1831. I hope I just said 1835. The book was published. In 1831, de Tocqueville tours the United States to undertake a study in American-style democracy. The result of his analysis is this classic work, Democracy in America. At bottom, de Tocqueville is concerned with social change and the challenges of living under a democratic state. For all purposes, we'll find it illuminating when de Tocqueville says the most natural privilege of man, next to the right of acting for himself, is that of combining his exertions with those of his fellow creatures and of acting in common with them. De Tocqueville says, I am therefore led to conclude that the right of association is almost as inalienable as the right of personal liberty, the right of personal liberty. So here we see de Tocqueville telling us that the Lockean notions of natural and inalienable rights, that they are not complete. Yes, life, liberty, and the right to hold property are important, but de Tocqueville tells us just as important is the right to freely associate and to join groups, to combine your exertions with your fellow creatures, and to act in common to petition the government for a redress of grievances. That's a critical point. All right, so now I just mentioned that Democracy in America book, 1835, is a classic, and so that means we should have some fun criticizing it. You know, we don't turn our critical eye off for anyone. So we put the critical eye to de Tocqueville, and we remember that he's touring the United States of America in 1831. He goes back to France, and in 1835, he publishes this notion, the notion that the social condition of Americans is eminently democratic. Men are there seen on a greater equality, more equal in their strength than in any other country of the world. Really? This equality, de Tocqueville says, will eventually find its way into the political world, and so the unrestrained liberty of association for political purposes is the privilege which a people is longest in learning how to exercise. If it does not throw the nation into anarchy, it perpetually augments the chance of that calamity. Now, wait a minute. We know something about the social conditions of a wide swath of American people by the time he comes and does his tour in 1831. Men are there seen on a greater equality. Some facts, please. By 1790, we know that approximately 700,000 enslaved Africans are in the country, 20%, a fifth of the US population around the time of the ratification of the Constitution are enslaved Africans. By 1800, that number had jumped up to 1.2 million enslaved Africans. And then in the time period right before the Civil War, that number had ballooned to 3.9 million people. When de Tocqueville comes then and says men are there seen on a greater equality, he must clearly be overlooking the African American folks there, right? He's clearly not thinking about slavery. Okay, so now let's give a good, strong operational definition of what is an interest group. We're going to say, and now you see an operational definition is a definition that's like a toolbox, right? Like you give someone a toolbox, that's like giving them an operational definition. So one part of the definition is going to be something that you can use. Let's say your toolbox has a screwdriver. Then another part of the definition is going to be your hammer. And another part of the definition is going to be your wrench, right? So a good, strong operational definition of a thing is going to have parts that you can operationalize, that you can put into motion. So what is an interest group? An interest group is an organized group of individuals. And what are they looking to do? They are looking to use their money to make campaign contributions. Why would they do this? They're going to use their money to apply political pressure and to make persuasive arguments. Why would they do this? They're looking to apply political pressure and persuasive arguments to influence elections. What do you get from influencing an election? You get your favorite candidate elected to office. And why do you care about that? Because you want your favorite candidate to influence the government and vote on public policy. And why do you care about how they vote? Because the policies that your favorite candidate votes on, because you've given him campaign contributions to be able to do so, it's going to turn around those votes and they'll produce benefits for the members of the group. So the goal of an interest group is to use money to apply pressure, to influence elections, to get your favorite candidate elected into office so that that candidate votes on policies that produces benefits, either financial profits or something else, benefits for your interest group. Okay, there's two broad types of interest groups that we tend to think of. I want to use three phrases. They're going to mean, well, six in total, but three apiece. I want to use these three phrases because it really depends on what source you're reading that will help you operationalize what we're talking about here. Perhaps you are reading the New York Times, and then the New York Times refers to interest groups as private groups, for example. Or maybe you're listening to CNN, watching CNN, and they talk about economic groups. Or maybe you go somewhere else and that media source is talking about corporate interests. Let's accept that private interest groups, economic interest groups, corporate interest groups, they are all the same. Their goal is to produce benefits for the members of that group, right? The private/economic or corporate interest group is not looking to produce benefits for the whole of society. They're only looking to produce benefits for the members of that group. They're looking to secure economic and policy benefits, mostly for their members, in a way that non-members would not benefit. For example, the policemen's union is not advocating for the firemen. Remember, in a municipal budget situation, the police, right, the salaries of police officers and the salaries of firemen could very well come from the same municipal source funding, right? The same pot of money. And so they're more likely to be in conflict. If the policemen get a raise, the firemen said, wait a minute, we need to get a raise, right? So they're advocating for the members of their group. Let's contrast this with a public interest group or an ideological interest group, or maybe we'll even call it a non-connected interest group. A public interest group is looking to produce benefits for the whole of society, as opposed to providing benefits for a select group of private or corporate interests. So the public interest group or the ideological interest group has has as a goal to produce benefits for the whole of society. They're looking to address broader societal concerns that are not necessarily, could be, but not necessarily connected to the occupational interests of their members. Good examples. I think I have a slide here with some examples. Do I have a slide? All right. Well, yeah. Well, okay. Well, just by way of definition, you see that environmental groups, civil rights groups, religious advocacy groups, those would be examples of public or ideological interest groups. Let's go back to economic or corporate interest groups. Remember, these are groups that serve the interests of their members. Some examples that are laid out in your book pretty clear, right? Let's start at the bottom because now we are here. The trade interest group or the professional interest group, these groups take stands on issues that affect the job description or even the job permanence of the members of that group. They're looking to protect the wages and secure the jobs of the people that are associated with that industry. Oh, for example, I'll take a personal note with you, the American Political Science Association. Now, a corporate interest group, these are the groups that are most closely connected to large-scale corporations and their associated interests, right? And they tend to have the most money, right? Just clearly tend to have the most money. And so the goal of the corporate interest group is to influence policy making, is to influence legislation. And I'm not cutting any corners with you. I'm going to say it like this. They're looking to ensure higher profit margins. The Motion Pictures Association of America is the one that I was thinking about. And what are they looking to produce? They're looking to have, for example, they're looking to increase the punishment surrounding anti-piracy laws. An agricultural interest group, as a corporate or an economic or a private interest group, is going to hold disproportionate influence relative to smaller farmers, right? Now, it can include small and large private farms, but the large-scale agricultural interests are those large-scale, multinational, transnational agri-corporations. They depend on close ties with policymakers in order to get laws passed favorable to their economic bottom line, right? Often you have industry-specific organizations for most crops and commodities that are produced on farms, right? Thinking about cotton, soybeans, corn, sugar, coming from the corn. All right, and then we also have labor interests. We're talking about the unions. American unions can be large and successful even as they are declining in their political power in the 21st century. Their goal is to influence policymaking and legislation to ensure job stability and higher pay for their employees. Let's move forward. Moving away from private or economic or corporate interest groups, let's go to on the other side of the scale, public, non-connected, ideological interest groups. Remember, these are interest groups that are looking to produce benefits for the larger society as a whole. Corporate interests are one type of ideological interest group. These are looking to protect the rights of consumers. You think about the effort to get poisons out of the water, to make people wear seat belts, to keep lead out of paint, or produce clean air. Some examples of consumer interest groups is the AARP, right? American Association of Retired Persons. Hope I got that right. And then Consumer Reports. Another example of ideological or non-connected interest groups are those that serve the religious beliefs to spur their members to political activism. Some, I think, fun to think about organizations in this category are the John Birch Society or the Family Research Council, pardon that typo there. And then another type of public interest group are those that serve environmental interests. Perhaps they're working to curb the environmental excesses of corporations, making sure that governments do things on purpose to protect the environment, stop global warming, for example, like the Sunrise Movement or the Sierra Club. Now let's talk for a moment about the primary function of lobbying. The primary functions of lobbying. They are going to be threefold. Number one is to provide for is to represent the interests of American people before their government. Second, it serves as a vehicle to mobilize rank and file American citizens to be able to petition government for a redress of grievances. And then third, a third function of the interest group is to literally watch government to make sure that laws are having their desired effect. The first function rather of lobbying of an interest group is number one, let's call it representation, right? The goal of an interest group is to provide an avenue by which American citizens can be represented in front of their government in ways that are beyond what your elected representatives do. You vote for a member of Congress, you vote for a senator, governor, maybe even president, and you hope that those folks advocate for things that you need to make your lifestyle better. True. But the First Amendment says that you don't just have to vote for them. You can do more than voting. You can join an interest group and combine, de Tocqueville, combine your exertions with those of your fellow men and act in common with them in order to lobby officials, in order to get people to understand the goals of your interest group and then have those goals reflected in the political agenda. This is what we would call agenda building, the effort of the interest group to get its policy goals reflected in the things that Congress or legislatures are doing. Under the guise of representation, interest groups can straight up write the bills. You'll remember in class, at least in the 5 o'clock class, I showed you guys a video about the Medicare prescription drug bill and how that was passed. And you'll remember with me that the pharmaceutical lobby literally wrote that bill. A second function rather, of the interest group is to provide to be the vehicle that allows citizens to mobilize so that they can petition government for a redress of grievances. So interest groups help citizens engage in collective action, where large groups of people just literally petition the government, try to get people to do things. We're talking in ways beyond merely voting, right? So lobbying has various forms, and so just put a couple of down there, right? Grassroots lobbying, and then the political activity that looks to influence the outcome of elections. We'll call that electioneering as a subset of mobilization, as a function of interest groups. And then a third function of interest groups, let's say your interest group is successful and you are able to, one, get your goals reflected in the things that the legislature is doing. You get a bill passed, you get a law passed in your favor. Well, the interest group, they have succeeded, but they do not stop. So the interest group also has as a function to literally be a watchdog, to watch the activities of the government. That word watchdog is used on purpose. You remember I ask you folks every now and then, what color was George Washington's white horse? And I ask you that question to tell you that the answer to the question is inside the question itself. Well, how does an interest group perform a watchdog function? Well, what does a watchdog literally do? Okay, so watchdogs, they're supposed to bark and alert you of danger. And then if that guy sticks his leg inside your window, a good boy, a good watchdog is going to bite him on the ankle, right? So watchdogs bark to alert of danger and then bite to punish wrongdoing. So the interest group then performs rather a watchdog function in that they monitor policies to determine if the laws are having the desired effect. If a watchdog agency, rather, let's say, successfully gets a law passed to, let's say, keep water clean in Flint, Michigan, for example, then the goal of the interest group will be to monitor that law to make sure that the water is in fact clean in Flint, Michigan. Another watchdog function of an interest group is to rate elected officials, to produce scorecards on various web pages that provides information to the members of that interest group and to the general public. And one good web page that does this is called votesmart.org. I was holding that for you guys in class, but you can go there on your own and check it out. All right, And so the last thing here on the slide set here is to think about what an amicus curiae brief. You'll remember that we looked at amicus briefs briefly when we were doing the judicial branch, when we were talking about, you know, the job of the Supreme Court. Remember amicus curiae, right? Friend of the court. A friend of the court brief is a legal argument provided by someone who is not a party to the case, but someone who can be affected by the outcome of the case and thus would like their argument, would like their point of view heard before the court. You'll remember with me when we were doing our discussion of the Supreme Court, I was giving you a discussion of Shelby County versus Holder. You remember we mentioned that the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Roberts, wrote the majority opinion where he said that section of the Voting Rights Act should be disqualified, should be removed because there's no more racial discrimination in voting. That was the argument that won the day. You'll remember that the notorious RBG, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, wrote a fiery dissenting opinion where she argued that getting rid of the Voting Rights Act because there's no racial discrimination in voting is like getting rid of your umbrella in a rainstorm because your head is not being wet. Okay, now the amicus brief that was filed in the Shelby County versus Holder decision was filed by the NAACP. It was filed on behalf of people who have received who have, let's say, been punished by or who've been discriminated by historic discrimination in terms of voting access. The amicus brief, right? The case is called Shelby County, Alabama versus Eric Holder, who was Attorney General. The NAACP is neither of those. However, the NAACP submitted an amicus brief saying, please hear this case in our particular way because we're going to be affected by the outcome. Now, interest groups influence the judicial branch because they submit amicus briefs, right? You might, and I'm going to argue for you, well, I would have argued for you in class more stridently, that an amicus brief is how democracy gets injected into the work of your court system. Remember, on the federal side, federal court judges and justices are appointed for life. They do not submit themselves to elections. So you are able to inject your views by virtue of an amicus brief being filed on behalf of the interest group that you join. All right. I think I'm gonna stop talking right there. All right, so that's enough of that. Yeah, okay, that's enough of that. More later. Thank you for listening. I'll be in touch.